Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really jumping into a huge period of change globally.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at the rise of maritime empires, roughly 1450 to 1750.
And we're going to structure this around a few key things. How states built that power, how economies and labor shifted dramatically, and how slavery evolved during this time.
It's a lot to cover, but it really sets the stage for, well, the modern world in many ways.
Our mission, really, is to pull out the most crucial stuff, the drivers, the impacts, without getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Sounds like a plan. It's easy to get lost otherwise. This era is just packed with events and changes.
Definitely. So, okay, let's start at the beginning. How did these European powers even manage to project themselves across the globe like this? We often hear that phrase, gold, God, and glory.
Right, and it's a useful shorthand, but, it simplifies things a bit. Gold, yeah, that's huge. European states desperately wanted new trade routes, access to valuable goods like spices, silks.
And obviously well for the state itself.
Exactly. Then God, the desire to spread Christianity. That was a genuine motivator for many, though. It often clashed pretty starkly with the methods used.
That tension is definitely there. Profit versus piety, sometimes.
For sure. And glory, that's the competition.
Yeah.
Intense rivalry between Spain, Portugal, later the Dutch, English, French. Everyone wanted prestige, power, dominance. The three things were really tangled together.
Okay, so let's look at the early players. Portugal, they pioneered this trading post empire idea, right?
Yeah.
What did that actually look like?
Well, initially, the Portuguese weren't setting up massive colonies like Spain did in the Americas. Their focus, especially in the Indian Ocean, was controlling the trade routes themselves,
How could you do that?
basically with firepower.
Hmm.
They noticed a lot of the existing merchant ships in the Indian Ocean weren't heavily armed, so the Portuguese brought in these heavily cannoned ships.
And just force their way in.
Pretty much. They seized control of key strategic ports, taxed trade, and used their naval strength to dominate shipping lanes. It was about controlling the flow of goods, not necessarily governing huge territories at first.
Okay, so naval muscle over administration. Now, Spain took a different tack, especially in the Philippines, more like their American model.
Yeah, that's a really important contrast. Spain basically replicated its American colonial strategy in the Philippines. They didn't just set up trading posts, they established full-blown colonies.
Meaning Spanish administration, settlements.
Exactly. They imposed their systems, collected tribute and taxes from the locals, and used coerced labor. It directly mirrored things like the encomienda system they were using across the Pacific and the Americas.
Right, a direct transfer of the colonial blueprint. Then the Dutch kind of muscle in and become the new big players in the Indian Ocean. What was their edge? Those ships, the fluids.
The fluids were definitely a big part of it. They were brilliant cargo ships, cheaper to build, needed smaller crews, held more cargo, a huge economic advantage.
So efficiency.
Massive efficiency. But also, like the Portuguese before them, the Dutch were absolutely willing to use force. They were highly organized, ruthless in displacing the Portuguese, and established their own tight control over key spice trade networks.
So better ships, same forceful methods.
All right.
Got it. Now, France and Britain seem a bit slower off the mark in this region initially.
They were involved, yes, setting up trading posts in India and Southeast Asia, but their initial presence wasn't as dominant as the Dutch or Portuguese.
Why was that?
Well, for the British in India, for example, they ran up against the Mughal Empire, which was still very powerful at this time.
Too strong to challenge directly.
At this early stage, yes, the British East India Company mostly stuck to coastal trading posts. They couldn't really project power inland against the Mughals yet. That comes later.
Sets the stage, though.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so you had these European powers making waves, but it's crucial to remember, as the sources point out, that the existing trade networks didn't just vanish.
Absolutely not. That's a key continuity. While European powers were carving out their niches, existing networks involving Middle Eastern, South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian merchants kept humming along.
So people like the Swahili Arabs, Omanis.
Gujarati's, Javanese merchants, they adapted. In many cases, the overall volume of trade increased, so even with European involvement, these established merchants often continued to profit, sometimes even more than before. They found ways to work within or around the new systems.
That's a great point. It wasn't a simple takeover.
Yeah.
Okay, but not everyone welcomed the Europeans with open arms. We see resistance, particularly in Asia. often through restrictive policies. Ming China, for instance.
Right. China had that earlier period of massive maritime exploration under Zheng He, but then policies shifted inward.
They became more isolationist.
Largely, yes. There were complex internal reasons, debates about priorities. When the Portuguese showed up, the Ming court was suspicious. Trade happened, but often through, let's say, unofficial channels, bribery.
Not exactly open doors.
No. And eventually, the Ming expelled the Portuguese, trying to limit foreign influence and maintain stability.
A deliberate turning away. And Japan, under the Tokugawa shogunate, took a similar path. Right. Though maybe for slightly different reasons.
Yeah, Japan had just come out of a long period of internal warfare and was unified under the Tokugawas. They were initially quite open to trade.
Oh, that changed.
It did. They became increasingly worried about foreign influence, especially Christianity, potentially disrupting the unity they'd fought so hard to achieve.
Fear of cultural division.
Exactly. They saw it as a potential destabilizing force. So they expelled missionaries, cracked down hard on Japanese Christians, and eventually restricted trade and contact primarily to the Dutch, and only under very controlled conditions at Nagasaki.
So concerns about social cohesion driving policy there. Okay, shifting continents now. These expanding trade networks also had a huge impact in Africa. The Asante Empire, the Kingdom of the Congo trade, was a catalyst for them.
A massive catalyst. For the Asante in West Africa, trading gold, ivory, and unfortunately enslaved people with Europeans, first the Portuguese, then others like the British, brought immense wealth.
And wealth translates to power.
Absolutely. It funded the military expansion, helped them consolidate a powerful state, and interestingly, allowed them to resist British colonization attempts for a considerable time.
So trade fueled strength and resistance, initially at least. What about the Congo? The story seems a bit more complicated.
It is. The Kingdom of the Congo, further south, also developed strong ties with the Portuguese, trading gold, copper, and enslaved people. Their king even converted to Christianity, along with much of the elite.
Sounds like a close relationship at first.
They brought wealth and influence initially, yes. But the increasing Portuguese demand, particularly for enslaved people for the plantations in the Americas, put immense strain on the kingdom.
It became exploitative.
Deeply exploitative. It fueled internal conflicts and ultimately contributed significantly to the kingdom's decline and fragmentation. A real cautionary tale about the potential downsides of these interactions.
Definitely shows the uneven power dynamics.
Okay.
Okay, let's pivot to the Americas now. European colonial economies there were heavily agricultural, right? Sugar, tobacco, cotton, later on, which meant a huge need for labor.
An insatiable need for labor. And this is where we see a mix of labor systems being used, some adapted from existing practices, others newly imposed and incredibly brutal.
Let's start with the adapted ones. The Spanish used the Inca Mita system.
Yes, the Mita was a pre-conquest Inca system where communities owed labor to the state for certain periods for things like road building or military service.
So the Spanish saw this and thought,
we can use this. They adapted the Mita system, twisting it to force indigenous populations into grueling, dangerous labor, especially in the silver mines, like the infamous Potosi mines. It was taking an existing structure of obligation and repurposing it for colonial extraction.
right, exploiting a familiar system for new, brutal ends. Now, on to the new systems that emerged. Chattel slavery. This was different and horrific.
Fundamentally different and horrific, yes. This involved the forced transportation of millions of Africans across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage. The key term is chattel.
Meaning property.
Exactly. Enslaved people were legally considered property with no rights, subject entirely to the owner's will. Bought, sold, inherited. And crucially, it became racialized, tied explicitly to African descent and hereditary. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved.
A system designed for perpetual, dehumanizing bondage on a massive scale. Then there was indentured servitude. How did that work? Was it an alternative?
It was different, yes, though still often very harsh. Indentured servitude was based on a contract. Typically, poorer Europeans would agree to work for a master in the Americas for a set number of years, maybe 4, maybe 7.
In exchange for
passage across the Atlantic and maybe some land or freedom dues at the end of their term. So there was an end point. They weren't property for life, and their children weren't born into servitude. But conditions could still be brutal.
a chance at freedom, but a tough road to get there. Okay, 2 more Spanish systems, encomienda and hacienda. How did the encomienda work? You mentioned it earlier.
The encomienda was a grant from the Spanish crown to a colonist, giving them the right to demand labor and tribute from a specific group of indigenous people.
And what did the indigenous people get in return, supposedly?
In theory, protection and instruction in Christianity from the encomendero, the grant holder. In practice, it was often just brutal forced labor and exploitation, very similar to slavery in many ways, though legally distinct. Some compare it to a kind of feudalism, but far more exploitative in the colonial context.
Right, the theory and practice were miles apart. And the hacienda system, how is that different?
The hacienda system developed a bit later and was focused on large agricultural estates, haciendas owned by Spanish elites.
So, big farms or ranches.
Exactly, producing crops or livestock, often for export. Indigenous people were often forced to work on these haciendas, sometimes through debt peonage, where they were essentially tied to the land through debt.
So the main difference from encomienda was the focus. Hacienda was more about direct agricultural production for the market.
Yeah, you could say encomienda was initially more about controlling populations and extracting tribute directly, while haciendas were land-based agricultural enterprises. Both relied heavily on coerced labor, though.
Got it. Okay, let's zoom in specifically on the development of slavery itself during this period. The sources mention continuities with older forms, but also major devastating changes. What existed before this Atlantic system really took off?
Well, slavery certainly wasn't invented in 1450. It existed in many societies, including within Africa itself. There were established slave trade networks across the Sahara, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean.
And what were those forms of slavery typically like?
It varied hugely, but often enslaved people in, say, the Islamic world or parts of Africa might be integrated into the household or society over time. Sometimes they performed domestic work.
Less of that complete chattel status?
Often, yes. There wasn't always that rigid, hereditary, race-based definition. And in some places, like parts of the Islamic world, you even had instances of enslaved individuals rising to positions of significant military or political power. Not the norm, but possible.
Okay, so a complex picture beforehand. What changed so drastically with the rise of these maritime empires and the colonization of the Americas?
Several huge things. First, the purpose shifted overwhelmingly towards agricultural labor on plantations in the Americas. This created that huge demand specifically for male laborers, leading to that skewed 2.1 male-to-female ratio in the Atlantic trade, wrecking demographics in parts of Africa.
The demand shaped who was taken.
Massively. Second, the sheer scale was unprecedented. We're talking over 12.5 million people forcibly transported across the Atlantic over about 350 years. Just dwarfed previous slave trades in terms of numbers and distance.
And the third change.
The development of virulent racial ideology. In the Americas, slavery became fundamentally fused with blackness, with African descent. This was used to dehumanize enslaved people, to justify the extraordinary brutality of the system, and to create a permanent inherited status based on race in a way that was distinct and particularly insidious.
The scale and the racialization. Those seem like the absolute key, horrifying transformations. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We've traced how European nations, driven by that mix of gold, God, and glory,
Right.
built these vast maritime empires.
Right, using naval power, establishing trading posts, and in places like the Americas and the Philippines, full-scale colonies.
We saw how Asian powers like China and Japan reacted, often trying to limit European influence through isolationist policies after initial contact.
While in Africa, engagement with trade fueled the rise of states like the Asante, but could also lead to exploitation and decline, as in the Congo.
And then in the Americas, the colonial economies demanded labor, leading the Spanish to adapt systems like the MITA and leading to the development of new, brutal systems.
Including indentured servitude, the encomienda, the hacienda, and most devastatingly, race-based chattel slavery on an unimaginable scale fueled by the transatlantic trade.
It really underscores the interconnectedness of it all. Economic drivers, political ambitions, religious justifications, all weaving together to reshape the globe, often through immense violence and exploitation.
Absolutely. And the legacies of these systems, particularly the racial hierarchy constructed to justify chattel slavery, are things societies are still grappling with profoundly today.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. When you think about this era, this relentless pursuit of profit, the clash of cultures, the exercise of raw power across oceans, how do you see the echoes of these maritime empires in our world now?
Yeah, what economic structures, what social assumptions, what inequalities might still have roots tracing back to these world-shaping centuries?
Definitely something to reflect on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.